This devotional is the first of two for Friday, March the 10th, 2023. Now, both devotionals will be longer than I would normally take, but because the Ten Commandments are so central to laying the foundation of our faith and our understanding of sin, I'm taking longer than I would normally take. Now, this devotional is titled A Display of God's Majesty on Sinai. It is part 1. It is from Exodus chapter 19. Now, before we dive into the deep end of this study, let me take a moment for a review. Now, as we come to Exodus chapter 19, let's reflect back. Beginning with Exodus chapter 19 and verse 1, we're told that this is now 3 months into the journey of Israel out of Egypt, now entering into the wilderness. Now, remember, Moses is leading a people who have suffered the oppression of slavery for 4 centuries, and it is a daunting and exhausting task. Now, already we've seen where the tribes of Israel have experienced the joys of victory and the despair of hardships that included thirst and hunger. However, above and beyond the physical stress of the journey, Moses faced the constant threat of murmuring and insurrection to the point that we read in Exodus 17 and verse 4 that the people were almost ready to stone him. Now, Moses, as we looked at Exodus chapter 18, had followed the counsel of his father-in-law Jethro, chosen, taught, delegated to capable men the task of judging the people in, and I quote, small matters, chapter 18, verse 20 through 25, and then freeing him to judge what he described as the hard causes in chapter 18 and verse 26. Now, that brings us to Exodus chapter 19. Now, the first part introduces us to the location where Israel was at this time, and it is encamped at the base of Mount Sinai. And so we read in chapter 19 and verses 1 and 2, it's in the 3rd month, when the children of Israel were gone forth out of the land of Egypt, the same day they came into the wilderness of Sinai, where were come the desert of Sinai, and had pitched in the wilderness. There Israel camped before the mount. Now, Mount Sinai, also known as Mount Horeb, had been the place where God had first spoke to Moses out of the burning bush, Exodus chapter 3. Now, here the Lord promised Moses, here at Mount Horeb, this Mount Sinai as we know it now, the Lord had promised Moses in chapter 3 and verse 12, when thou hast brought forth the people out of Egypt, ye shall serve God upon this mountain. Well, Israel was encamped at Mount Sinai, and the time there would be 11 months. Now, during that time, God gave Moses his law and commandments. At this time also, Israel was transformed from 12 tribes of enslaved people to a mighty nation with one God and one law. Now, notice with me Exodus 19, verses 3 through 6. Now, and this is God's charge to Moses. Now, while the people pitched their tents at the base of Sinai, Moses, we read in verse 3, went up unto God, and the Lord called him out of the mountain. Now, acting as Israel's mediator, the Lord charged Moses with the task of reminding the people all that he had done for them. Then, in a statement that evidenced his loving grace and mercy, the Lord described how he had thrust his people out of Egypt, carrying them along with the tenderness and speed of an eagle that shadows her eaglets, chapter 19 and verse 4. Well, Moses then was charged with reminding the people if they would obey God's voice, keep his covenant, he would, chapter 19 and verse 5, treasure them above all people. Now, the Lord promised Israel would be, verses 5 through 6, a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. Now, God would later ordain Aaron and his sons to serve Israel as his priest. However, his desire was that Israel would be a holy nation and a light of the Gentiles. And I'll put an asterisk here and say, of course, we know that Israel failed miserably to keep the covenant. Now, notice chapter 19 and verse 7 through 8. Here we have Israel's affirmation of God's covenant. Now, as God's mediator, Moses called the elders of the people, the leaders of the people, the leaders of the tribe together, and he presented in chapter 19 and verse 7 the Lord's proposition. In fact, we read in verse 8, all the people answered together, and they said, "All that the Lord has spoken, we will do." And then Moses returned the words of the people unto the Lord in chapter 19 and verse 8. Now, as you look at chapter 19 and verses 9 through 5, here we have Israel's preparation to meet the Lord. Now, to fulfill the institution of the covenant, Moses commanded the people, chapter 19 and verse 10, to personally and ceremonially sanctify themselves and wash their clothes. Moses revealed that on the third day they would see that the Lord would descend upon Mount Sinai, make his voice and presence known to the nation in verse 11. Israel was commanded, set a boundary about the base of the mount, and was warned if any approached, they would be put to death. Now notice then chapter 19 and verse 16 through 25. And here we have the appearance of the Lord. And so we read that on the third day, the presence of God was seen in the thunderings and lightnings and a thick cloud upon the mountain, the voice of the trumpet exceeding loud, so that all the people that was in the camp trembled in verse 16. Moses then led the nation to the base of Mount Sinai, verse 17. Now the whole mount, we read in verse 18, was engulfed in smoke as the Lord descended upon it in fire, and the smoke thereof ascended to the smoke of a furnace, and the whole mount quaked greatly. It was as though it was a volcanic explosion, and yet it was not. It was the presence of God that was there. And then we read in verse 19 that the sound of a trumpet, a shofar, if you would, a ram's horn, it grew louder and louder until we read in verse 19 that Moses spake and God answered him by a voice as commanded. Moses warned the people not to approach the mountain. Now, a second devotional will follow this, but let me give you a closing thought on Exodus 19. Now imagine seeing Mount Sinai engulfed in fire and smoke and feeling the foundations of the mountain and the earth moving at the sound of God's voice. What a dreadful, frightening display of God's power and presence. To receive his law and commandments, we read in chapter 19 and verse 12, the people were required to be sanctified, holy, set apart unto him. In fact, in verse 10 of chapter 19, God required of his people what was true of himself. Ye shall be holy, for I am holy. Tragically, you would not know it to look at 21st century churches. But what was essential for Israel is requisite for all believers. In fact, the Apostle Peter would write in 1 Peter chapter 1 and verse 15 and 16, as he which hath called you is holy, so be ye holy in all manner of conversation. That is, in every area of your life, in your word, in your conversation, in your actions. In verse 16, because it is written, be ye holy, for I am holy. Tragically, the church today as a whole has forgotten God's holiness and is so much like the world that you cannot tell them apart. My friend, I would encourage you, go to heartofashepherd.com, and there you will find 4 questions that you can use as a study question, as a family Bible study, or as a class study that gives you an opportunity to go back and reflect on the things that we've learned in our study of Exodus chapter 19. A second devotional will follow. It will be Exodus 20, where the 10 Commandments are given to Moses. God bless, and bye-bye.